Hi YouTube, welcome to another edition of Horror Hands, and for this video I'm going to go through the 20 must-own horror movies for your collection. So this is kind of a response video. I've seen a few other YouTubers do this countdown. John from Project Ellsworth, I've seen him do his. I've seen Jason from Horrific Nightmares do his list. And a lot of people have done different genres as well, which has been interesting to watch. But I thought I'd focus on the horror movies. So this is going to be 20 horror movies that you must have for your collection. And these, pretty much all of these are brilliant movies, classic movies. But they are, as well as kind of changing the landscape of cinema, they're also very kind of culturally important as well. So yeah, these are 20 horror films that I think everybody should own. Okay, so the first movie is Sharknado. And wait a minute, Sharknado? How did that get there? Oh, no. No, the first movie that everybody should own is Alien. So Alien was a total game changer, not only for horror, but also for science fiction and things like that. It's of course been a very influential movie. It spanned a whole franchise and it's just an excellent, almost perfectly made movie. It's also as well the only sort of creature feature, like monster feature, that I find truly terrifying. Most sort of creature features I watch with a big smile on my face, eating popcorn, whereas Alien, I am pretty much like huddled up, absolutely terrified, because it is a really scary film, I don't mind saying. It's also one of the few horror films that I genuinely care for every single character in it, and I don't want to see him get killed, which is almost unheard of in movies. So yeah, Alien, a very influential movie, and an excellent film as well. So that is number one on my list. And I'm just going through these alphabetically. I couldn't really turn this into a countdown. Okay, next movie is An American Werewolf in London. So awesome movie, but I had to include this for that werewolf transformation scene. Arguably the greatest practical special effects that we've ever seen. Really inspirational scene. It kind of made practical effects a serious thing. And I wish more people would still sort of practice those kind of effects, but they've never kind of been done better, I don't think, than American Werewolf in London. So great movie, but also got to have it on the list for that transformation scene. And it is still the werewolf transformation scene to beat, in my opinion. Okay, the next movie is The Exorcist, and I don't want to go too much into these films because they are very much well known, but just a flawlessly made film, an absolutely fantastic film, still very scary to this day. It scares me a lot, and it seems like a film that it was made for adults. It's not geared towards the teenage audience or anything like that. It's a very grown-up film, made by a big Hollywood studio before they followed trends and before they kind of just went by demographics and kind of fashions. They used to make amazing, excellent films, and The Exorcist to me is maybe the greatest example of a horror film that was made during that time of true epic filmmaking. Such an amazing film. It's lost none of its power. I couldn't do this list without The Exorcist. Okay, next up we have the original Frankenstein with Boris Karloff. In terms of sort of classic vintage horror, I think Frankenstein is arguably the most recognisable out of all of those. All of the Universal Monster movies are excellent, but I'm just trying to stick to one movie per franchise, and for me, kind of Frankenstein is my go-to out of the lot. Like I say, it's very, very iconic. It's a really well-made film. It's very kind of evocative in terms of bringing up sympathy for the creature and the monster and things like that. And yeah, still a very, very important and necessary film for today, really. So yeah, had to include the original Frankenstein on the list. Okay, next up is the first Friday the 13th. Now, the first Friday the 13th, it isn't actually my favourite film in the franchise. It's a film that I can kind of... It's good, but there's other slasher films and there's other Friday the 13th films that I prefer more. But why is it on the list? I couldn't leave it off because of its inspiration and its influence on horror cinema and the slasher genre. So, of course, it spawned the Friday the 13th franchise, which is my favourite horror franchise. And whereas kind of Halloween is said to have started the slasher genre, I think Friday the 13th really came along and gave it like that gusto, and people sort of really started to churn out slasher movies after they saw the success of Friday the 13th. So very influential film, and one that I think is still quite important to horror cinema, and in particular the slasher genre itself. So that's that one. Okay, next up is Fright Night, and this is a personal favourite one of mine. It's just an excellent movie. I absolutely love Fright Night. I have done since I was a kid. I was obsessed with watching it as a kid. It's just a movie that works in every sense. It's brilliantly acted. The people in it look like they were born for the roles that they play. Chris Sarandon as Jerry Dandridge is just captivating. I love the music. The music is beautiful in this film. The effects are fantastic. It's scary, it's funny, it's just an excellent film. And it's a strange one because Fright Night, it does sort of tend to get a lot of love, but I still think it's an underrated movie. It never quite reaches the upper echelon of horror recognition, and I think it should, because it is just such a well-made film and such a fun film to watch. So yeah, one that I wanted to personally include on a list of must-own horror films. Okay, next up is the original Halloween. So kind of touched on this with Friday the 13th, but very important film in terms of the way it changed horror. Was very inspirational in the slasher genre and horror itself. It's still a very effective film, and one that was really well made. It kind of did well for John Carpenter as well, kind of put his name on the map, which is important. And I just really respect what they did with this film. John Carpenter didn't have a lot. He was just trying to get a movie made, and he made a film as good and as influential as Halloween, which is fantastic. So another one that I couldn't leave off the list. Okay, next up is Horror of Dracula, Hammer Horror's first Dracula outing. And with this list, I wanted to try and represent sort of different eras and different kind of subgenres of horror. And I couldn't leave off the sort of 50s British horror movies that came out from Hammer Horror and studios like this. This one is arguably the most iconic. It's a great film. It looks great. I love the rich colours that Hammer Horror used to use. Still quite scary in places, and has done a lot in terms of inspiring so not only British cinema, but there's a lot of kind of European cinema that followed that sort of tried to recreate those Hammer tendencies. So yeah, again, another important movie on the landscape of cinema, in my opinion. Okay, next movie is Jaws. So my personal favourite film, I couldn't leave it off the list, but again, one of the most culturally important movies ever, not just in terms of horror, but in cinema anyway. Very scary film. I don't think anyone goes to the beach without thinking about Jaws. But also, this completely changed the landscape of cinema. in terms of the way movies are marketed and the way they're released. So kind of like all the big Marvel films and things like that that come out in the summer, that's kind of a result of Jaws being released in the summertime and being so successful. So yeah, a real iconic and game-changing film, and just an excellent film. It's an example of a big studio movie being made and being excellent, which I don't feel we see a lot of nowadays, unfortunately. So Jaws is a great example of when these big studios used to do it right. Okay, next up is The Lost Boys. Another personal favourite of mine, and I think one of the coolest examples of 80s filmmaking. The 80s for me is one of my favourite genres, and if you want to know why, kind of watch a film like The Lost Boys. It's another really fun film. It's got great acting, great characters, great music, the effects are excellent, and just one that you can watch and just have a good time with. And again, just a really well made film as well. And I think a lot of people, when they think back to the 80s and 80s horror films, The Lost Boys is kind of a flagship to that kind of time and era, and it's a good way of showcasing why that decade was so cool. Okay, next up is the original Night of the Living Dead. I was close to putting both Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead on this list. I think either of them are must-own movies. But I think I'm including Night of the Living Dead for its cultural significance. You know, it was like the first movie to present zombies in the way that we see them now. It was an excellent film. No one had ever seen this kind of at the time. And yeah, just revolutionary in a number of different ways. Very, very inspirational film. We're still seeing its inspiration now. I mean, zombie films are as popular as I've ever seen them. And it's probably all due to Night of the Living Dead. And again, credit to George Romero, like John Carpenter. He made this with what he had and made an excellent film. So yeah, definitely a must-own in any horror collection. Okay, next up is Nosferatu. So again, in terms of vintage horror films, I think this one is very important. It's kind of sort of the earliest mainstream horror film that I can think of. I do have a couple of other films that are older than Nosferatu, but this is kind of like when I think of early horror films, this is kind of the first one that comes to mind. And again, it's a great movie. It's still effective. It's still scary now. The Max Schreck character looks hideous. Fantastic makeup. And again, in terms of horror representation, I feel you should own something like Nosferatu because, like I say, it is just like the first of its kind. One of the first mainstream horror movies that I can think of off the top of my head. So definitely a must own. Okay, next up is Psycho. Okay, another culturally important film. This is like the film that kind of took horror out of the dark gothic castles and brought it into sort of everyday society, where Norman Bates could just be the guy next door and he was doing terrible things. And very, very iconic. Of course, the shower scene, everyone still thinks of that when they're going in the shower. The music, of course, very inspirational. I still hear that now in everything from comedies to cartoons, and you know, all originated from this movie. Another really important hallmark of horror cinema, in my opinion. So that's that one. Now, next one, I was on the fence as to whether to include this one, but I am going to do so. And it's Saw. Now, of all the movies on the list, Saw is actually one that I don't particularly like. I'm not a huge fan of Saw. However, I really am happy that it's in my collection. I think it's a must-own because out of all kind of modern horror films, very few have had the same sort of effect and lasting power of Saw. You know, it's spawned a huge franchise, which you don't see that much nowadays. It's been very inspirational. We see a lot of these kind of like torture style movies now, probably as a result of Saw. So, although I'm not the biggest fan of this film, I can't deny the impact that it's had on the horror genre, the huge franchise that it's spawned, and the success that it's had. So, it's definitely one that I wanted to have in the collection, just to represent that more kind of modern style horror film. And like I say, Saw is probably one of the most successful of those movies. So that's that one. Okay, next up is Scream. So I know some people love this, some people don't like Scream, but I don't think you can deny the influence that it had in the 90s and the success that it garnered. By the time this movie came out, horror was really not doing a lot. The slasher genre had died out completely, and this kind of came out, changed the rules a little bit, turned horror around, and was a huge success. And we've got like a resurgence of late 90s slashers, all of which I kind of look back fondly on now and enjoy most of them. So yeah, you can't deny the success that Scream had and the influence that it had on late 90s movies. I myself really love the film. I think the Ghostface killer is really iconic. The people in it are really cool, sort of fun 90s sort of stereotypical characters. And it's always a film that I've enjoyed watching, and I do remember this coming out and thinking it looked really scary at the time. So those are fun memories for me. But yeah, I think this is an important film to own. Like kind of Friday the 13th and Halloween that came before it, this sort of re-injected the slasher genre with a new lease of life. And culturally, it's quite significant in like a 90s kind of way. Okay, next up is The Shining. Stephen King hates it, but I think it's an amazingly well-made film. In terms of horror, you don't see films that are quite of this artistically well made. You know, Stanley Kubrick, he had some amazing visions, and he was able to put them out there on screen. And this was just a fantastic mix of like ghost stories and supernatural stuff and things like that. Jack Nicholson, of course, is very iconic with his character and Here's Johnny, that kind of thing. And it is an incredibly well made film, very scary, very lavish in what it does. And yeah, one that I think everyone should own. Okay, next up is Suspiria. I couldn't do this list without including some Italian horror. It's one of my favourite subgenres, and again, an important part of what makes horror so great. I've included Suspiria because it is probably the most well-regarded Italian horror film. And it is a great movie. It looks great. It's creepy. It's a great example of Dario Argento's artistic presence when making movies. It's not my personal favourite Argento or Italian horror film, but like I say, this is probably sort of the flagship of Italian horror, and it's excellent. So yeah, I think everyone should at least try and dip into Italian horror, and Suspiria is one of the best ones and one of the good ones to start with. Okay, next up is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Personally, I think this film is okay. I wouldn't sort of give it any higher accolade than that. But again, there's no denying the impact that this movie had, the success that it has. And in terms of kind of like grindhouse guerrilla filmmaking, I would say that this probably is the best example of that. And what I do love about Texas Chainsaw is how everything looks real. How the farmhouse and all the things around, they look like genuine sort of artifacts of bones and skin and things like that. The movie itself looks fantastic. A lot of movies that came out that were made in this sort of way don't look that good and that genuine. So credit to the filmmakers for that. And again, can't deny the success and the iconic status that this movie has developed. So yeah, everyone should own this movie. Okay, next up is The Thing, which we all know is just an amazing film. One of my all-time favourite horror films. I don't know how why someone wouldn't own The Thing in this day and age, to be honest. It is just one of the greatest movies ever made. So yeah, had to include The Thing. Okay, and last up of must-own movies is Zombie or Zombie Flesh Eaters. Again, another example of Italian filmmaking, but I think if you want to venture into more extreme gore, gruesome horror movies, this is one of the best examples of that. It delivers in terms of the gore and the nastiness, but also it's a great film. It is a really good film by Lucio Fulci, who I think at the time he just got what he wanted to do. He understood what people wanted and delivered on that flawlessly. It's a film that everyone should see and should own, in my opinion. So that is the 20 must-own movies. I've left a lot of good movies off. I do realise there's a lot of great stuff that I couldn't include, but that's my list. So let me know what you think of that, guys. Do you own all these movies? Do you disagree? Is there something that I've missed off? Let me know. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more videos.